Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first speaker series in Toronto. Everyone in Toronto want to clap? Yeah, woo! Post-Canadian Thanksgiving, this is an auspicious time. So my name is Aurelia. Whoa, Jalen, whoa. My name is Aurelia. I work at the Mozilla Science Lab, which is part of the Mozilla Foundation that works on projects and curriculum to help scientists open source their research. And I'm here to introduce you to Harlo Holmes, who I met a few years ago when we were both in this Google group listserv called ArtSec. That's shorthand for Art Security. And it was a community for people building technology around privacy and provocation and security hacks and exploits and art principally. And I remember, as just a starter anecdote, when it started, the organizer wanted it to be maximally open, so he made it a Google group because he thought that would be a really easy way for people to auth in and join the group and contribute to the conversation, and we'd have a very diverse contributor group. But then as the group matured, there were a lot of conversations about, we're talking about security and hacking. Is this something we want associated with our profiles? Is this something we want wrapped in our metadata? And that's kind of the topic for today's talk, right? We're constantly navigating this careful tension between open source and free software projects and promoting openness and the desire to protect and preserve our privacy and our users' privacy. So Harlo's going to talk about metadata, some of the most vulnerable information in this tension that we face constantly. And Harlo was a longtime mobile developer for the Guardian project. But now she's the director of Newsroom Digital Security at Freedom of the Press Foundation, which you might be familiar with them as the host of one of our Mozilla Foundation Open Web Fellows, and also as having a pretty impressive board of security experts, including Edward Snowden. And they're also the developers of SecureDrop, which recently has been a lot in the news because of some leaks, at least in the US, related to the candidates for our election. And for many other impressive newsroom projects. It's a product that allows people to safely leak data to newsrooms. So that's all pretty cool. Her talk is entitled Metadata is the New Data and Why That Really Matters. And after she speaks, I'll kick to questions. So anybody who has a mic from the other offices can chime in, but you can also ask questions on IRC and we will voice them for you. So thanks so much. Harlo, take it away.
Hi. Thank you very, very much for having me. I'm really, really thrilled to be here for a number of reasons. One, I've never visited Toronto before, and even just in the brief moments that I've been here walking around, I've just kind of fallen in love, at least with this neighborhood, not the city yet. I'm also really, really happy to be giving a talk at Mozilla. It's quite an honor. Mozilla has been one of the most important organizations in, just founding my career, and also has been one of the organizations that I was, most aware of when I first started using the internet. So it's quite an honor. And thank you very, very much, Aurelia, for introducing me in such a lovely and caring way. Aurelia and I had been once again, Open News Fellows with Knight Foundation and Mozilla, and that was an experience that changed my entire life. So I'm really, really proud to be with you guys today and to talk to you guys about the stuff that I've been thinking of in, the years since we first started this journey together. So thanks. So I'm Harlo. And as Aurelia mentioned, I'm the director of Newsroom Digital Security at Freedom of the Press Foundation. We have a new logo that's coming out, but this is our old one. I'm also, I got my chops, I guess, so far, we're always getting more chops in not only, coding, but also digital security. Primarily in mobile, but also, just kind of holistically across the board with a group called the Guardian Project, for which you might know as being, most famous for the first people to implement the Tor network in Android under a with an app that's called Orbot and an accompanying browser app that's based off of Firefox called OrFox. Both of those apps are currently maintained by the Tor project themselves, and of course, because Tor project receives so much code upstream from Mozilla, there is quite a huge, link between these two projects, and they're very, very important. I'm also one of the founding members of a group called Deep Lab, which is, I guess they call it we did call it, things have probably changed, cyber feminist collective of artists, activists, technologists, and critical thinkers who think about the issues of, contemporary technological ecosystems and how they come to bear on yourself as an individual. Primarily from a feminist perspective, because that's where we come from, but also realizing that the perspectives from people in those positions in society are often the ones to first feel the effects of technology in often negative ways, in unexplained and surprising ways. And so hashing those things out together, we feel serves a broader purpose for user protection, user privacy, and security as a whole. And so, as my mom says, I still don't understand exactly what you do. And she says it with kind of like a stink eye. So I'll explain. As a member of Freedom of the Press Foundation, I head up the educational team. This Freedom of the Press Foundation actually comprises three major components. One is technical, as Aurelia mentioned, the software package called SecureDrop, which is, it's actually a software and hardware and way of life, like get a tattoo kind of a system, because it's very involved. But that allows it enforces source protection between journalists and, sources who wish to remain anonymous. A lot of our clientele are what are called adversarial journalists. So they do work with whistleblowers who have very, very important information that they want to get out to the press in order to manage it and help the public comprehend it in, a responsible way, while minimizing the risk to themselves as they get that story through. I personally had, another a very, very important part of Freedom of the Press Foundation is in our legal, quote unquote, department. Our executive director, Trevor Tim, is he's a litigious person. And so the majority of his work has been focusing on, the legal pressures and the challenges to freedom of the press in the United States and abroad, and often helping in campaigns to help such journalists, activists, et cetera, bring these issues to the fore and to protect them as best as they can in the legal realm. But as for me, I'm in digital security training. I work with a number of journalists and filmmakers that span the gamut from large press outlets that you may know very, very well by name, people who are in large consortiums like press clubs, so scattered independent journalists, even internationally, who come together to work on issues in current events. I also work a lot with freelancers because, the press is funded in such a way that a large majority, or not necessarily majority, but a large trench of the news that we receive nowadays actually comes from freelancers who do not have the organizational support of, a New York Times or a Washington Post, but yet their digital security is really, really, really important. And in fact, actually, the freelancers and the citizen journalists and activists that contribute to the press narrative are kind of the or they are a very, very important group that informs exactly where these kind of pressure points and gotchas and exploits reside in the way that consumers use technology. And that's because simply because they don't have the overarching support of large news organizations. They rely on consumer stack, the consumer tool chain. So their ISPs are, consumer grade ISPs, the ones that we have at home. Their routers are consumer grade routers, which are, privy to a number of exploits that we don't even think about. Their communications are, usually shepherded by free services. You aren't paying for the product, so you are the product type services. Like Google, Yahoo, all of those things. And so helping these people understand exactly where they're most vulnerable in terms of their data and their privacy has become kind of like the most important battle that we fight. I also serve as an interface between tool makers and these quote unquote end users, which is like, kind of a disrespectful term to call someone when they're, trying to film in the middle of a protest and there are flashbangs going on behind them. But that said, a lot of the dog fooding, which I'm sure is a term you guys all know and have come to love, comes from people on these lines. And so through advocacy, well, yeah, and taking, listening very, very carefully to like nascent bug reports where people will, show me their phone and show me exactly how it's bugging out and not necessarily know how to translate that into the classic bug report in the GitHub template is very, very important active listening that I perform quite frequently. And so this also rolls into curriculum building, writing a lot of how-tos, writing a lot of primers about, how these certain tools can come to get you if you're not using them properly. And finally, educating people on it, organizing events that are available to the public. And that's where a lot of freelancers come together. Also creating tailor-made curricula for these people in order to properly address their risks. And this is a custom risk assessment, and being able to deliver curriculum and training to these people based off of the technologies they use and how they use them. Oh, that was the wrong one. Okay. So I'm here to talk about metadata. And the first thing to do is to define it. What is metadata really, right? So the first is forensic. The standard definition of metadata is it's data about data. From the forensic standpoint, it's data about containers. Those could be files. Those could even be, like the data packets that are in transport, when one uses the internet or when one interacts with any kind of service that is connected. It includes things like permissions, size of files, the or in the internet realm, it determines like sizes of certain packets, how DNS was resolved, things like that that are kind of I guess boring, but I find them incredibly fascinating. There's also the contextual metadata, which actually cribs a lot from library science, which I find is a really, really great synergy between the technical and the liberal arts. The contextual data, like, often has stuff to do with like the title of something, who authored it, as, your computer reports to your Microsoft Office authoring program. But it also contains, I guess, kind of where data can be defined as data about content. This also encompasses what Duke University calls content about content. So when you when you think of, for instance, a digital photograph where there is EXIF data that contains information about the author, the date it was taken, the type of camera it was taken on, and things like that. But also, there's actually fields in there in the EXIF data for copyright information. And actually, a fun fact about that is that, or at least in the original EXIF specifications, the length of, or the number of characters that you could add to the copyright section was actually 3 times larger than the amount of content that you can add to other descriptive fields. And what that says is actually about metadata's unique position as like this kind of, at the same time, human readable and machine readable arbiter between computing culture and our litigious culture and our capitalist culture. And so when you look at metadata, these are actually very, very interesting things to ponder. So another example that I like very much is, the rise of disparate namespaces in HTML. You've all seen the like OG namespace or the Twitter namespace or the FB namespace for Twitter. Those are actually really interesting because embedded in that content and contextual metadata is actually like a very, very specific attempt on behalf of those people who create namespaces to situate themselves in SEO land, to the point where I gave that example about EXIF metadata or EXIF copyright data being incredibly long. There's also like the OG description tag, for instance. Actually, there's a cottage industry of SEO experts who advise on how to properly craft the description text in a way that when it's picked up by robots and parsed with natural language processing in order to properly situate it in search results and indexing schemes, they tailor it to look more like human speech, but and they also like kind of crib it in a way where it's no longer than a standard tweet. And so you see this tension where in the metadata, contextual metadata is once again trying to bridge this weird space between human comprehension and machine comprehension in very, very innovative ways. Finally, there's service-defined metadata, which is an interesting space. These are usually, this is kind of metadata that appears at the whim of these services. So for instance, in one service, let's say a Bloom filter, which actually like resolves how many contacts you have. So like in a messaging app system, when that contact list populates and says so-and-so is on WhatsApp, say hey or whatever, or Signal, etc. That can be determined as metadata. However, it depends on the service, whether or not that data is exposed to users in order, like exposed to, sorry, not users, but exposed to third-party services via an API where it can be indexed, worked upon, quantized, and all these things, and ultimately monetized. And so that's interesting because the service-defined metadata actually kind of pokes this hole that in the membrane that separates what's metadata, meaning like literally just for machine use, and data itself, stuff that can be worked on via APIs. Oh, actually, yeah. So when you take all of these definitions together, ultimately, metadata reveals itself to be two things. The first is data about events. When you think about, the metadata that someone might look for in a forensic analysis of a file, they're interested in when that file was accessed by which user and how. They're not necessarily looking at the content of the data, and that's usually to see whether or not someone actually saw it when they claimed that they didn't, or whether it had been changed from the original. And so this data actually establishes prominence. And that gets a little bit tricky in social media because, well, actually, Sadet Harry, who is the community manager at the Coral Project, another really, really excellent joint Mozilla night venture at the New York Times and the Washington Post, describes, or well, she was talking about the hashtag, but this is actually one specific, or this is a type of data or type of metadata that I'm pointing to when I talk about these kind of newer definitions of metadata, in that they create what are called ready-made affinities. And so a ready-made affinity actually, it encompasses, well, the phrase itself is actually really great because the ready-made part of it describes the machine part. It's encapsulated, it's parceled, and it's ready to go, ready to be worked upon algorithmically or otherwise. But the affinity part talks about, the human stake in it. Okay, so ultimately there's two things to know about metadata. One is that it moves very, very quickly. And two is that it has a physical dimension. And both of these things we don't really think about, but I'm going to guide you in thinking about those things in this way. Metadata has velocity. Okay, so anyone who's had a liberal arts education just a little bit is familiar with Deleuze and Guattari's Mille Plateau, which is a seminal work to or that students use in order to think around ideas of space, power structures, and control. And anyone, once again, who went to grad school knows what I'm going to say. It's a reference to the state for any of you guys who get it. Mille Plateau, otherwise known as Thousand Plateaus in English, has this concept of the smooth space. And what that means is that it is the nomad space. It is the the nomad being a person or an actor, we'll get into that later, that has kind of the ability to feel out their whatever terrain they are on as possible in order to get certain things done. Terrains themselves, or rather the features of your terrain, the systems that you use, the well that you drink from, the place where you charge your phone, all of those things don't necessarily matter, and doesn't really matter where they are. It's just the smooth space is just a very, very organic way of navigating all of these things in order to make them work for you. However, they also mentioned that it is an inchoate battle space. And what that means is, given the unknowableness of this terrain, there are always going to be kind of sparks of conflict where, the nomads or whatever try out different things in order to break systems, in order to kind of corral them into experiences that they can then control. The smooth space is never really known, once again, but because it's unknown, it is the place where people try out things in order to make them work for them, however they're positioned. Conversely, there is the striated space, which I guess there's a t-shirt actually in the audience that perfectly kind of encapsulates that. This is the sedentary space, the space where things are all known, where absolutely everything is segmented, everything has its purpose, the locations of all these things are known. Secondly, it's the space of state control with a capital S, not to be confused with the State, the comic troupe, which I referenced before. The space of state control, exactly that. It's where absolutely everything is known and perfectly carroted, perfectly put into boxes. And all of the resources that the space might contain are infinitely accessible, especially by the state that surveils. So if any of you guys had seen Stranger Things, you'll know that there's this pretty good allegory of in order to get from one space into another, you can think of an ant on a tightrope that has the ability to kind of circle around the tightrope, and by doing so, kind of upturn what side of the space that they're on. And most people in a space actually experience every space in this way without actually knowing it. And that means knowing at the same time what your limitations are in the striated space, but knowing what you can be capable of in the smooth space. And you shift them as you want. Metadata, and I mentioned this before, that puncture between what is metadata and data. Metadata becomes data when actors flip these digital spaces from smooth to striated, and sometimes back from striated to smooth. Okay, so really quick, here's some definitions before I get into like stuff that we care about. The actor. You can think of the actor as your stakeholder, invested denizens of a terrain, and in which case they can be users such as you and I and everybody else. They can be ISPs. They could, and so we're thinking about these on the technical level. Usually when you think of the actors at ISPs, you think about how they shape their network, for instance, in order to preserve the health of the network. You can think of them as the corporations themselves. So like, the business interests that Facebook has a vested responsibility to uphold. That's also an actor. They can be governments and other, representatives of the law that try to influence, the terrain in one way or another. And so what's the terrain? The terrain is sites, services, digital infrastructures, the cloud, etc. And the combination, which is the most important, Deleuze and Guattari use the term assemblages, of these services that encourage use by actors, that encourage content interplay, otherwise known as the cyber. And finally, there's the state, which is actually not a person, place, or thing. It's not a noun. It's actually a state. It's the perpetual agreement, the stabilization of an agreement between all of these actors to, one, reside in the terrain under immutable rules, and two, to grant centralized authority to surveil and enforce these rules. And I know that the terms I use seem very, very politically weighted in one way or the other. However, and also some of my examples are going to be weighted one way or the other. But that said, this is actually kind of neutral in terms. The state, or the state doesn't actually mean like the man necessarily. It's actually just a mindset that all of us are kind of privy to, no matter where we fall on whatever line. Okay, so I'd like to first start out talking about Facebook. Becky Kazansky of Tactical Tech actually released a really, really great bit of research regarding their work with a variety of LGBTQI activists internationally about their digital security concerns and privacy concerns surrounding Facebook. The research that they did comprises of interviews with a number of these actors. These are like nomadic actors, we'll say, that we advocate for, who realize that Facebook is a service that is, once again, a means to an end, and it's actually their calls to action. Those are what they carry, what they work for. And sometimes, Facebook does it, but it's not only Facebook that supports the various media at their disposal that supports, their action. So they talked specifically about their use of secret groups, which they use to reserve trusted space to speak, I guess, freely and without surveillance. That is the perception. They also realize that, information needs spreading, and that's what makes Facebook such a great medium. The information itself does need to be spread, and if Facebook is what gets that done, then that's what gets it done. Another key thing is that they usually employ like monikers or nicknames or jack names, however you want to call it, in order to signal their inclusion in a group and in order to promote trust to others circulating the group. However, the problem is that terms of services within Facebook constantly change that kind of upset this apple cart. So in terms of like the data and the metadata stuff, we're actually looking at the data such as your photos or what occupies your thinking, your post or whatever. That is content. However, the access control, the taxonomy that describes the access control of this data has the ability to kind of change at the whims of Facebook. And so that actually has a very, very chilling effect. One is that it just kind of becomes apparent. Uh, well, I mean, other than like the lack of trust in a service that arises when the rules of access control change on you without you being properly notified or properly walked through it. That's that destruction of trust puts people in a very, very desperate and sometimes dangerous situations. However, what it does is it actually just kind of reinforces this maxim that in certain companies, what is considered, or metadata versus data is actually like equated on this value proposition for the company. So by changing the accessibility of certain assets on the site and not informing users properly, what that signals is that a service has discovered that this group of data under this type of umbrella has become profitable. And so adjusting the taxonomies that, regulate the access controls to that adds added value as, third parties, advertisers, et cetera, access this data more and more via the API. We see this a lot, not only in, in the examples that Kazansky and Tactical Tech had mentioned, but also, here in the United States. I mean, ACLU just kind of dropped a really, really important bit of research on the relationship between law enforcement agencies in the United States and their surveillance of protesters via kind of loopholes in the way that public data and private data can be accessed. She goes further in this bit of research to bring up the term responsibilitization, which has its own provenance, but I guess we'll all attribute it to the work of Seda Gersses, Arjen de Wolf, Heyman, and Pearson. The first two I have met, the second two I have yet to, but they're all really great. Responsibilitization is this notion that the onus of keeping up with changing terms of service, changing taxonomies, and the implications to your privacy falls on the user themselves, which is a really, really, really hard position to take, especially when your key day-to-day material is actually in the work that you do. It's the messages that you spread, it's the actions that you perform, and it's the truths that you want to tell. Ultimately, in the digital security community, or in the training community, this is a really, really contentious point, or maybe not contentious, but I would say it is a flashpoint to a certain extent. How to properly balance our responsibilities to the people that we train, in a way that we can inform them of these changes in a timely and important and an impactful way, but also realizing that for both the trainers and the people that we train, it shouldn't be a burden that we shoulder alone. And so responsibilitization is unfortunately the law of the land in the industry that I work in. So if you further along with the Facebook analogy and responsibilitization, it's always this, things always change. And you kind of see this as, metadata opens itself up to other services via APIs. And also not only on the technological realm when we're talking about the APIs, but we're also talking about on the business level in terms of acquisitions and acquihires and all these things. So Facebook, which is the owner of both WhatsApp and Instagram, has a lot of social graph data. It had been revealed just a couple of weeks ago that WhatsApp is going to start sharing this data with Facebook. And also, simultaneously, or not simultaneously, but also like alongside of it, Tinder now has linkability to Instagram. And so what that means is that not only does it mean that matching up your like dating life with your just in time like live stream of your life is not necessarily a good idea for your protection, but it also brings up like the second battle that we've been fighting with Facebook for a while, which is like the real name policy. So of these services, Facebook itself, Tinder, Instagram, and WhatsApp, Instagram is actually one of the spaces remaining where there is no real name policy. However, when through metadata, if you are able to blend all of these things together, the various identifying points of users become reified, become part and parcel of the user themselves in a way that is not separable as they traverse the various services to do their thing, to live their best life. So yeah, it's the end of the Jack name, essentially. At this point, I guess I would want to talk about one of the most important lessons that we in the open source community have learned over the past couple of years, and that actually has to do with the development and the growth of the Signal protocol. So Signal is a lovely messaging app, one of many messaging apps in the world, but it's special for two reasons. One, it provides end-to-end encryption in a way that is currently currently speaking, state of the art. And end-to-end encryption is important, but that's another talk for another day, and I would love to have it. Invite me back. However, another thing that's important about that is the way that they treat metadata. So actually just recently, it was also with the help of ACLU, we discovered that there had been a subpoena for user records on Signal. Signal actually does not, I mean, of course, it's end-to-end encrypted, so the content of the message is not available to any law enforcement agency globally, or even Signal themselves. However, the metadata that has to do with like users is what's important to note here. So Signal actually does not keep, or when you first sign up to Signal and you're, discovering and contacts and things like that, there is an algorithm that assists you in doing that, but Signal actually does not retain that data at all. So there isn't contact data that is sitting on Signal servers. WhatsApp, however, uses the same protocol as Signal. The Signal protocol, and that was actually a really like monumental change in open source sustainability, which I might get to later. However, because of its ties to the Facebook ecosystem, where the minute Facebook touches your phone, it slurps up all your contacts, the relationship to user data is drastically changed. So what you're seeing is an ecosystem where, I guess maybe 10 years ago, we all thought that end-to-end security was literally going to save us all. However, things have changed in such a way in the crypto wars even that this metadata of contacts and patterns of usage and things like that is data in and of itself. And that's where the wars are fought. Really quickly, I want to pinpoint something about the velocity of metadata. Of course, movement over time. And that actually has to do with like something a little bit baser than our apps and things like that, but actually has to do with radios. So phones have radios, computers have radios, that's how they are phones. And they communicate to cell towers and the strength of which is metadata in and of itself that is collected and shared with these carriers, shared with these towers, but also aggregated on your device and sent to the people who own the or who manufacture these devices and service these devices. That actually says a lot about movement. And so this is something that we kind of take for granted. We all know about the use of stingrays in the United States and not only here but in other countries. That's once again another talk that I love having. However, what's interesting about this is when you look at, for instance, a refugee camp. So in Calais, which is where this photo is from, or in Germany, or in Jordan, or in Rwanda. I mean, globally, this is happening. Usually, what happens is that SIM cards are distributed, which is an excellent resource for refugees as they seek to stay in contact with the people that they love. However, because the SIM cards usually come from one provider, you get to a point where network shaping actually has the effect of digitally hurting people. Not hurting, I mean, sorry, hurting people. And so what's interesting about that on a metadata level is like not only does it exactly exemplify what I mean about this traversal of terrains and the battles that are fought on them to turn them from something unknowable into something that is ultimately knowable, but it also discusses the militarization that metadata can hold. So there's a difference between, querying a telco for movements of a certain user, which we often see in the Stingray cases. Or cases that are just totally about oversight. However, there's a difference between that and explicitly either explicitly shaping a network or leveraging what you know about a network's capabilities in order to herd people en masse. And so whereas the first is kind of like an intelligence strategy, the second is explicitly militaristic. So to conclude, I guess I'll talk about the reification of the self, which is another liberal arts term, which pretty much describes the process by which a person comes to know themselves from the representation that they get back from, in our metaphor here, for all intents and purposes for this talk, from the services that they use. So these services are reflecting back at us. And so this is... the way that this process kind of works on people is similar to how, when now you take out your maps and you get to see a just-in-time heat map of where the traffic is, which is actually incredibly beneficial. You also get to see, the peaks of your favorite bar or whatever, so you know when to go and when to stay away, on which days. The information usually is accompanied by people typically spend 2 hours at this place, and that actually is the amalgamation of a vast amount of metadata that's being collected. But then it starts to happen to yourself. And so I want you to think about, the actors, the nomadic actors that we discussed first in our first example about Facebook. In my digital security trainings, I often do this one thing first. It's kind of like a magic trick. I tell people to go to their account on Google, and I tell them to look at their activity, their web and app and web activity, web and app activity. And so usually what happens is people gasp. It's like one of those commercials, where you're like, you can save on car insurance. And they're like, oh my God, that's the quote. People are literally blown out of their minds by what they never knew was being collected and then turned back at or presented back to them. I would like to just state that I actually point out Google as being for a company that does accumulate as much data, as much metadata, and turn it into data as they do. They do have a very, very serious and committed stance towards educating people on how these things are used and where they are and how to turn them off. However, this is there by default, and it is there if you don't, and it will continue to accumulate on you if no one intervenes on your behalf beforehand. So here's my, like October 9th and 10th history. It tells me what, I've done on search, what I've done in the developer land, what I've done in the ad space, etc. But also, I mean, the thing that I find the most interesting is actually the information about the apps that I use and when I use them. Now, Google does say that certain or not all apps will report, the when and where in this way uniformly. However, I did notice, a while ago that one of the apps that would show up in a very consistent time was my clock app. So that says to me, that presents back to me exactly my habits about when I wake up and press snooze. In addition, that says when I'm able to like query these for patterns in my day-to-day, such as when am I, most likely to be involved in a Twitter thing, or when am I most likely to be doing research for work? When do I do my banking? And it's usually actually when I'm about to get in a cab. But it also does say things about, even though I do not, even though like information about the context of my conversations and the parties that I'm conversing with are not not available. They're usually very opaque. It does say a lot about when, and so that actually gives me a lot of pause when I engage in services such as, Android. However, I don't often have a choice. And if I don't have a choice, there's a whole realm of actors who do not have choices as well. And you have to ask yourself, who am I doing that for? So, quick aside, that was a lot about the smooth being turned striated. There is something that doesn't necessarily have to do with privacy, but something that I like that I saw at Mozilla, which is the striated turning smooth. I really, really do like you guys' hack of GitHub here, where you take full advantage of the metadata available and the tools to do that in order to find the most satisfactory and complete experience for doing things like organizing the Mozilla Festival, which is upcoming. I think that that's a really, really ingenious way of kind of like hacking back at established systems and carving out space, or, not necessarily carving out space, but like doing that flip where it's turning smooth once again. It's pretty cool to see. Mozilla definitely has like a proven track record about answering these questions about what data they collect, why is it being collected, who has access to it, how long does it live, and most importantly, how you advocate. And all of these things are super, super duper important, but or at least from my perspective, your partnership and help in advocating on these issues is really the most important thing that we in the digital security community can ask for, and your support is absolutely invaluable. Yeah, so one thing that was pretty cool about seeing this commitment to data, however it actually has root within Mozilla culture, I do not know myself, but I thought that it was interesting to look at that metadata and have a glimpse into where this is being adapted. So when you put out like a little bitty manifesto about, your commitment to like data ethics, and then it gets forked by a number of people at like a variety of organizations around the world that have similar goals in mind, that's actually really, really heartening. And it's a way that we can take back our space. So thank you very, very much for having me. I would love to take your questions or to rap more about any of this. And you can find me on Twitter at Harlo. Thanks.
Yay, thank you so much, Harlo. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to voice in any of the offices?
There's one over there. Oh, no.
Oh.
Why did we think that would work? Okay, I had two questions. One from very early in your talk. You mentioned that you were collecting that you were collecting feedback from practicing journalists in the field who were, collecting feedback from people who were experiencing or using these technologies or tools in like live events, protests, police crackdowns, a number of other things. How do you effectively collect feedback from users who are either in or have been in that kind of like a live fire exercise, that kind of high stress exercise? How do you effectively collect feedback from people in those circumstances?
It's a little bit ad hoc, and sometimes it has to be. I mean, there is, once again, the privacy issue. So I am more interested when I take this type of feedback. I'm more interested in um, just pinpointing exactly like what technically went wrong and what pattern of usage might contribute to that. So it's ultimately like it's a listening exercise where you look at someone's complaint, you even have them kind of demonstrate it if they're able to, and then you just go to and then I fill out a GitHub template bug report for them. So it's a work of translation, and I try to keep it as or the data that I collect as separate from the individual experience as possible. Do you have another question? You said you had two.
I don't want to hog the floor if anyone else has got them. Okay, follow-up question. No, sorry, not a follow-up question. When you were talking about responsibilitization, one of the things that we're confronting as an organization right now is that we've had a longstanding, very, almost religious devotion to user privacy and so on. One of the challenges we face is that it's difficult for us to create meaningful experiences for users if we don't understand anything about them.
Mhm.
And we've got a very sort of careful, we've got a very careful tightrope to walk there. But I'd like to know what you think about, like, what does responsible in security? We've got responsible disclosure, right? But what does responsible disclosure, what does responsible change management look like when we're talking about the social realities of licensing, of user communication? Like, what do you think, if there's a right way to talk about how we're changing how we handle X piece of data and how it impacts user, what's the right way to do that?
Well, that is where transparency goes a very, very long way. There are people should know exactly like uh, how data is being used and how they contribute to it. Retention policies are key. Things that expire as quickly as possible are much better than things that stick around forever. There's also just, I guess, I feel that people would be served a lot more if they knew when terms of services changed. And that means that there must be like some sort of, kind of like terms of service whisperer that actually translates, a lot of the legalese into actionable like checklist of items that people can understand. Um, I and also there's advocacy that needs to be done, such as like having the capability to push back against uh, exorbitant amounts for data from certain like government agencies globally. That's actually like a transparency and like being able to action on things that you think are unjust on behalf of the user are kind of the best roles that we can play.
Anyone else? Toronto? Or any of the other offices? Type, type, type. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Harlo, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. When is the next speaker series? November 16th on failure. Whoa, happy topic for all. But yes, do sign up for that or respond to the calendar invite. And thanks again. Oh. Yes, sure.
Oh yeah. This might be a little bit in the weeds, but it is something that I've been thinking about. On the technical level, actually, there is dangers in data being scraped that prevent data from actually expiring when it should. So on a technological level, actually, be prepared to work that in or work the appropriate safeguarding measures of data into your own products, but also like helping arbiters of data, such as like, for instance, open government data that keeps like a lot of citizen data on record. Helping those organizations do that job better would actually help a lot. Yeah. So that was my wit of the staircase.